morning I want to teach from the subject purposeful pivots. Purposeful pivots. So for the past few weeks, my dad's been in a new series talking about the wind of God, and he's been talking about how the wind of God comes in, the wind of God brings in change and things of that nature. And so he talked about the four types of wind, and so it depending on the direction is depending on what the wind is for in our lives. So if it's coming from an east wind, it brings judgment and correction. If it's a west wind, it's bringing in deliverance and mercy. If it's a north wind, that's a common wind that brings the presence of God and it drives away evil. And if it's a south wind, it's a warm wind that brings prosperity, blessing, provision, and restoration. And let's gonna be mad that you made her baby cry. So after I saw those, I was kind of thinking to myself, what am I gonna do on the wind of God? Because the first thing I sent on Pastor Hagan, it was very similar to what he already had. So I had to find something different to come with this morning. I kind of think Lorenzo, I think he touched on my points. And it sounded kind of familiar. Mm-hmm. All right. So I started thinking about pivots, and the reason I got on it is because I was watching. I like to watch these different sports podcasts and things of that nature, and there's one of them called The Pivot, and they always talk about when they talk to different players or people they talk to, they ask them what's the biggest pivot you ever made in your life. So when I was watching the episode, I was like, ooh, okay, let me stop. And I just went and looked up the definition. Trev, I ain't being deep with the definition. Just like I was saying last time, it was just a regular Webster's, no Hebrews, none of that. Right. So the definition of a pivot is to completely change the way in which one does something. To completely change the way in which one does something. So in other words, whatever way you're going, you have to stop that and go a whole nother direction. And so it made me think that when we go through when God brings the winds in our lives, regardless of whether it's something that brings prosperity, whether it's something that may be judgment, maybe it's something that may be deliverance, you always have to make a pivot after it. Because if you don't pivot after it, you're just going to go in the same direction you were already going. All right. So when we make pivots, we must understand that it's not just a disruption in our lives. Many times it's a divine disruption. So when God brings divine disruptions, it's for a purpose in our lives. And I kind of hinted at this a little bit yesterday when I was talking, but whenever God comes in and he moves us in a new direction or tells us to pivot or go another way, it's for a reason. I saw a quote that says, pivoting isn't plan B, it's part of the process. It said pivoting isn't plan B, it's part of the process. So a part of our process, a part of our walk with God, a part of how we do what we do is going to take pivots. And so when I first heard it, I said, ooh, that sounds good, but I don't want that to just be something that sounds good in my head trail. I got to be able to align it, with the word. And so I just started thinking, what causes us to have to make different pivots in life? So one way is loss. When we lose things in our lives, sometimes it takes for us to have to pivot to move around it. And I'll have examples of each one of these in a minute. The next one is when you walk into a new season. Anytime you walk into something new, you may need to pivot and do things a different way. It made me think about, when you go in people's houses, people do things differently in their houses. Some people don't want your shoes on their carpet. They pay too much for that white, right? So you may have to come in there with the socks on. You may have to, some people don't allow you to do different things that you would normally do in your house. So recently we had some issues with my mother-in-law, and that day it was kind of hectic all over the place, and her other children live out of town. So our house was the house maker. So everybody came to our house, right? And I left, went to the store, got some stuff for everybody, and I came in. And I'm used to our house being a certain temperature. I'm used to our house being at a certain volume level, and I'm used to our house being just, that's your home. But that's not what I came back into when I went in the house, right? So I had to immediately get myself together. It ain't about you. You know what they going through, right? So I get in. I'm like, I'll be all right. They like it a little colder. So, just wrap up. We got plenty of those little, blankets or whatever. We'll be okay. And I was helping them get their things in because everybody was just in a quick rush. And one of her sisters came over. She said, is it okay if we go and buy some alcohol to drink while we're here? My first response was, no, in my head. I thought to myself, I said, well, it's not the end of the world. Can you make it a little bit easier on them while they're here? So I said, okay, that's fine. And he did. And I thought about it a little bit later on, and I said, well, I don't know if maybe I would have made the right decision or not. So I don't know. And then they came back to me and they said, we know you don't really, we know y'all don't do that, and I just really appreciate you doing that. It just made me feel a little bit more comfortable. I said, okay, all right. So I felt a little better. All right. And so I think about when you go into different places, sometimes you have to make decisions that you wouldn't normally make. All right. So if you apply it to our lives, that doesn't mean that you drink the alcohol that they buy. That means that you stay the same. Okay. All right. I ain't gonna stay on it. Okay. So when you go into new places, you do different things. All right. So you could also have a test from God. And I'll get into a little bit more what I mean by test from God in a minute that'll cause you to have to pivot your life. And sometimes promotion or blessings cause for you to pivot because the way you walked when you didn't have money is a little bit different than when you got money. All right. So when you have power, you walk differently than before you did it, before you had it. Right. So you have to be able to pivot. So the first cause we said that you may need to pivot is from loss. So the scripture reference I'm going to use for that is from the book of Ruth. If you go to chapter 1 of Ruth, you'll see that Naomi's sons had died, her husband had died, and so her, Ruth, and her other daughter-in-law had to figure out what to do. So the daughter-in-law was like, I love you, but I'm going back. Ruth said, I'm going to stay with you. So Naomi had to pivot. She had to pivot from a place of being a submitted wife to her husband to leading Ruth into where Ruth had to go next into her life. So we see here that she had to do something that she had never done, but she was able to step up and take the responsibility. Sometimes in our lives, our pivots means that even when we go through loss, we got to be there for other people. Sometimes it gives us a responsibility to be able to lead them. So I'm going to start at Ruth chapter 3. Ruth 3 verse 1, it says, one day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be provided for. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. Now, the point that I want to pull out here is one, that Naomi used the wisdom that she had gained over her life to help Ruth, but Ruth also had to pivot into doing something completely different than where she was before. So what Ruth had to do was follow the instruction. When it comes to the winds of God in our lives, when it comes to us being able to pivot properly, it calls for us to be obedient. Sometimes this obedience is going to be a little uncomfortable when you have to pivot. It's uncomfortable to have to completely change the way you're walking. It's uncomfortable to have to completely change the way that you would react to things. You know, when you used to saying stuff to people a certain way and you got to pivot and do it a little bit differently, it's not comfortable, right? So in this example, we'll see that she had to change what she was doing. Now, when she did it, it worked. She got married, and then we're going to see in Ruth chapter 4, we're going to see the blessing that came back to Naomi. I've often heard a story, and you just kind of stop reading when they stop preaching. But as you read, you see that it wasn't just a blessing for Ruth, it was something for Naomi as well. So let's go to Ruth chapter 4, verse 13. It says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So her doing a successful pivot came back as a blessing with her, and even in her old age. That says to me that no matter how old you are, if you're willing to pivot, God can bless you. That says to me, no matter where you are in life, if you're willing to pivot correctly, God can use you to bless other people, and you get blessed on the backside, right? So we don't do it for the blessing, but it's a good part of doing it, right? So we see even from that the generational impact that goes. Obed was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And we always hear about David being the man after God's own heart. Even in their bloodline, it was there. So she made a successful pivot, and we saw the blessings in both of their lives. And so it made me, once I got done reading this, Trevor, I was like, well, how do we handle a pivot? And God gave me three things, and I said these yesterday, I think, um, for my dad. And the first thing we see in how to handle a pivot is you must have resilience. When I think about resilience, I think about, y'all remember the little blow up punching bags? You punch it, it go all the way down to the floor, and it bounce back up. You punch it again, it come right back up. And as long as it's got air in it, when you hit it, it'll bounce up. Well, same thing for us. As long as we have air and breath in our bodies, we should be able to be resilient and bounce back, right? So whatever hits you, you should be able to come back from it to properly pivot. Yeah. So one way to handle it is you must have resilience. Two, you must have unwavering faith. This means that we don't let our situations sever our faith in God. If we're not careful, situations will cut off the connection that we have with God. That's why, like I said yesterday, it's not a wise thing to have your connection to God based on another person. That person mess up or have a bad season or do something wrong, you lose your connection to God, right? So we must not let our situations come in and put distance between us and God. And the third way is we must be willing to trust God during the design detours in our lives. All right. So in other words, I heard Pastor Darius Daniels say that when we write our plans and our visions, we need to write them in pencil. I was like, ooh, that's cold. He said, if you write stuff in pencil, you can erase it. If you write it in a pen, it's just there, right? And so he said, in our lives, we must be willing to flow with how God says things. And if you're not able to do that, it's going to cause friction between you and God eventually. Right? So we must be willing to handle God during the detours. And this takes me to, we talked about dealing with it in loss. Now we're going to talk about it going into a new season. So in Exodus 13, this is right after Moses and the children of Israel are going to be released by Pharaoh. I'm going to start at verse 17. It says, when Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said if the people were faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness towards the Red Sea. Thus the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. So I'm going to read it from the Message version. The same verses. Verse 17 said, it so happened that after Pharaoh released the people, God did not lead them by the road through the land of the Philistines, which was the shortest route. For God thought if the people encounter war, they'll change their minds and go back to Egypt. So God took them not the easy way, but the more difficult way, but it was for their good, right? He knew that if they ran into that fight, they weren't ready for that fight yet. He knew that once they had to go into battle, they weren't mature enough to handle that battle, so he took them a different way. So we know this is true from what we see happen in chapter 14. So I'm going to jump down to chapter 14 at verse 10 of Exodus 14. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. They run into a battle and they immediately regret the decision that they made, right? So God was trying to take them a different way to protect them. So in our lives, when things don't go the way that we feel they should go or the way it worked for other people, we really need to be saying, God, I appreciate that. God, thank you. I don't know why you took me that way, but I know it was for a reason, right? Okay, so we see detours when we go through detours in life. We become more effective as Christians. and we become more threatening to the devil. When we can properly handle our detours, when we can properly go places where it's uncomfortable, we can tell other people, hey, okay, this ain't comfortable, but it's got to be a reason why we're doing this. That doesn't mean that we give up, right? And that makes us even more dangerous because now we can build an even stronger army of people who can reach more people, right? So detours and pivots are beneficial in our lives. They are not detrimental. In other words, they are for our good. When we detour and pivot correctly, we become not just successful in ourselves, not just successful in helping other people, but being the example that we need, that God wants us to be as we're walking around. When people see that, you don't react the same way you usually would to stuff, it may eventually prick them to go, maybe I should try that. Or how did you do that? Or how did you get there? Then we have something to bring to them, right? So we saw that it was pivots from loss, one from walking into a new season. And then I'm going to use a personal example that sometimes God will test our lives to help us pivot correctly. By that, I mean that God can use our mistakes to help us do things or to help us grow. So recently, I had some stuff to go on at work a few months ago, and I had responsibility to do certain things and didn't do it, and got off of it. And so I had to find a whole nother place to work and do whole things. It was all my mistake too, Trev. I wanted to blame people, but I had to dig too deep to get that right. So I got to take the responsibility for myself. And so I go through the times of you're mad with yourself, you feel like it won't fair, you're blaming other people. And then after a while, I really feel like I heard God tell me, this is a mistake that you made too many times in your life. I'm going to let you feel it this time. So I'm going to let you feel it, because where I'm taking you next, you can't do that no more. So God took my mistake in the moment and taught me different lessons. And on the backside of it, because now I got another job that I start this week, and it's more money and all of that. But it was a lesson in it. God takes our mistakes, and he uses our mistakes to do three things. He uses them to manage us. In other words, he gets you back into alignment. You make mistakes, okay, get back in line. That's going to hurt you, or you're going to be able to hurt other people. He uses it to mold us into so he can use us correctly. And he uses it for what I need to mature us, so we're more effective as we walk into the next place. Because the mistakes you make here won't hurt the same as they will in another place. All right. So just an example, an extreme example. If you just a regular Joe Blow and you cheat on your wife, you just gonna get divorced or whatever else happened from it. But if you're responsible for thousands of people and you do that, you hurt those thousands of people. All right. So what we don't fix now becomes an issue for us later. All right, so we see that pivots come from loss. We see they come from us walking into new seasons. We see it comes from God God testing us to get us prepared. And we see that it comes from promotion. So the example I'm going to use from that is, and I'm almost done, is Joshua. So when we go to Joshua chapter 1, what we see here is Moses had just died, and God is putting Joshua into position to lead the people. So again, this is a huge pivot for him. He was the assistant to Moses. He was never number one. He was always number two, right? And he was great at being that. We see examples after examples of in the previous chapters about how he was there. Even when other people didn't believe, he was one of the ones that believed, right? And so when we get to verse 1 in Joshua chapter 1, it says, after the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant. He said, Moses, my servant, is dead. Therefore, the time has come for you to lead these people, the Israelites, across the Jordan River into the land I am giving them. I promise you what I promised Moses. Wherever you set your foot, you will be on land I have given you. All right, from the Negev wilderness in the south to the Lebanon mountains in the north, from the Euphrates River in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, including all the land of the Hittites. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live, for I will be with you as I was with Moses. I will not fail you or abandon you. So he is in a new place, new responsibility, a new place, a new promotion, and now God's going to give him his responsibility. Verse 6 says, be strong and courageous, For you are the one who will lead these people to possess all the land I swore to their ancestors I will give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey the instructions Moses gave you. Do not deviate from them, turning either to the right or to the left. Then you will be successful in everything that you do. We see here that obedience was essential to him being able to properly pivot. If we can't be obedient and listen to what God is telling us, he can't trust us to take us somewhere else. So if you listen sometimes and sometimes you don't, you may not be ready for where God is trying to take you, right? And so we see another principle here that says to be strong and courageous. So when we walk into different pivots of life, we can't walk into it scared. We may be uncomfortable, but we can't walk into it with a bunch of with fear in our hearts and not wanting to do it or speaking against it. We can never be successful in those pivots if we don't have the right perspective. So lastly today, we must be able to hear God's voice to properly pivot. Listening for divine guidance, it allows us to discern the right direction during transitions. When the winds of change blow, clarity from God helps us navigate through uncertainty and to make choices that align with his purpose for our lives. By us building this relationship with him through prayer, we position ourselves to recognize his cues. That's one of the things that Dad was talking about, why we should listen to the word every day, to be able to hear him clearly. We can recognize his cues, his when God's about to take you a different direction, when God's about to tell you to do something new, you'll be able to recognize that. So that in our moments of decision, we can turn to his voice to provide us with wisdom and reassurance on what we need to take the next step to get to the next place as we pivot. So as we apply these things to our lives, I always think that once I preach something, I'm going to immediately be tested on it. So once you are aware of something, then typically you run into a text that's going to test that. That's why when you say stuff like, hey, God, help me be patient, he doesn't make you patient. He gives you things to test your patience, right? So it's the same thing with this, right? So now we've been made aware of the different winds of God that's going to come into our lives. Once we start to experience it, we have to be able to hear his voice clearly, be able to have the right mentors in our life, continue to listen to the word from our pastors that are preaching there so we can apply it to our lives. So, God, I thank you that something I said today spoke to the people. I pray that as we apply these principles to our lives, God, that you will bless us, not just for us to have gain and more, God, that we'll be able to witness to other people. We pray for the ability to be able to go through these pivots and these detours in a way that we can be an example to help other people come in, God, that we can be able to further your plan and your vision for our lives. And we thank you for it in Jesus' name.